So this morning I'm with David Opar from Australian Catholic University. David, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
And hopefully over the next 20 minutes or so we'll have a little bit of an exploration into some of the fantastic work that's being done by David and his team at ACU in relation to injuries, quantifying risk of injuries and actually managing injury risk. So I suppose as an opener, David, it would be really useful for people just to get a little bit of an insight into your background, how you became to be involved in this fascinating area of work, and where you might actually see this whole thing heading.
Yeah, sure. So I did undergraduate studies in exercise science. Back then in Australia it was called Human Movement Studies or Human Movement Sciences. Was fortunate enough during my time there at RMIT, I met Dr. Anthony Shield, who was the most fantastic academic I'd ever come across, both from a teaching perspective and also from a research perspective as well. And Tony had designs on doing some research in the hamstring injury space. And so through the course of a couple of years, he moved up to Queensland University of Technology. I went up there and did my PhD after a year or two finishing from my academic studies or my undergraduate studies, and moved up to QUT in Queensland, sunny Queensland compared to Melbourne, to start my PhD studies. And so that was the start of it. As a young fella, and I like to think I could still probably play now, but played a lot of sport as a kid. Played Australian rules football, which is a unique code in Australia, and it's a sport where hamstring injuries are rife, and the ability to be able to tie in some of my academic interests with the sporting side of things that I loved as a kid, to me was a great appeal, and hammy struck as a great area to work in because it was something that still happened at such a high rate, yet there weren't a great deal, or there didn't seem to be a great deal of progress being made at the time.
Why are hamstring injuries so prevalent in Aussie rules football?
Yeah, well, so it's a sport that probably shares some similarities between the rugby codes, Gaelic football, and soccer. So there's demands for high-speed running, repeat effort, high-speed running or high-speed efforts, and there's a relatively long game duration as well. So they play about 120 minutes of game time across 4 quarters. With that said, the rates over recent times have probably been in a decline, which is a really, really good thing. And if you match that up with the fact that the game has evolved where the high-speed running demands have continued to increase over time as well, then there's probably been a really nice window and period of time here where the rate of injury has probably held steady or gone slightly downwards, but the demands of the game have gone up. So it tends to be that consistent exposure to high-speed running and the need to have to back up probably week on week as well.
So the rate of injuries are declining, and you're saying obviously the demands, particularly in relation to high-speed running,
Yep.
Have increased. So why is that then? I mean, you obviously have worked within the sport from the point of view, I suppose, of injury risk mitigation. And what kind of steps have been put into place that might have actually impacted on that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point you raised, the notion of risk mitigation. I think that's been one of the things that I've seen in recent times, is people have moved away from the notion of prevention and started to talk more about risk mitigation. It might be a nuance and it might be a really minor point, but it's actually understanding that what you're trying to do is you're trying to lower risk, and that risk will never be zero. Anytime you're driving a car or crossing the street, you're at risk of crashing your car or someone knocking you off the road. And it's the same with sport. Your risk of injury, and hamstring injury in particular, is never zero. But I think people have appreciated that there are certain factors that you might be able to target, and across your squad, not necessarily at the individual level, but across the squad, you might be able to lower the risk of injury in that group. So clearly there's been a lot of work looking at eccentric exercise, and I think there's been a greater appreciation for how important that is, and that there needs to be space found in the program for those eccentric exposures. And I think in more recent times, greater appreciation for the exposure to max velocity running within a week, within a season. I think they've been the two major things that have, certainly in Australia, have pushed towards mitigating the rate, because they're actually looking at mitigating risk of injury.
So I guess starting with the eccentric exercise, and in the first instance, I mean, eccentric exercise is something that I think across a number of sports has been quite difficult to gain acceptance because it's hard.
Yep.
And because certainly initially it precipitates quite a reaction in subsequent hours, days and the like. So what kind of steps are people taking now to actually try to encourage people to engage in these sorts of activities?
So there's probably a few elements to tease out from that, I suppose. There's an education component to it as well. So if the players are aware that they might feel sore after an exposure early on, maybe in pre-season or at some stage, that soreness is actually okay, and it's probably a really important driver for adaptation that will in time minimise their risk of injury. Educating the players and the staff educating the players around that is probably really, really important. Now beyond that, you've then also got the issue of the coach or the manager who actually doesn't want to lose any time and doesn't want players walking around saying they're sore. And so that's a really difficult situation to navigate. Some of the strategies we've spoken about with organisations is if you've got players who have got an off-season period, then if you are going to prescribe them anything, then get them to expose themselves to some eccentric loading for the hamstrings. They may get sore in that week or two coming back, but then by the time they lob back on your doorstep, you can then start to pull that work back into them and hopefully mitigate the likelihood that they'll have soreness that then might influence what they can do on the track, and then all of a sudden it makes its way to the manager, and that's when you're in a bit of strife. So the education component, I think, is important from the player's perspective, that soreness doesn't necessarily mean you've been injured, and actually it's probably going to be a benefit for you in the long term. But also looking at what strategies you might be able to implement so that you don't have guys missing training time and then impinging on the manager's plans as well. Fitting around those, I think, are some of the really important things. And then there's cultural elements at the club level, I think, as well. So if everyone at the club is on board with a philosophy and a direction that cuts across many areas, not just, say, hamstring injury, risk mitigation strategies, if you've got a cultural element that you understand why things are done, you understand why they're important, and everyone's on the same page, and I think that's a really important element as well.
So, I mean, I've worked in a number of soccer clubs in and around the UK, and you have a situation quite often, I don't know whether the same thing exists in Australia, where as somebody on the inside making suggestions as to something you might do slightly different, the suggestion often isn't quite so well received as if the expert comes in from the outside and perhaps delivers exactly the same advice. Would you say you see that? I know you travel around a lot speaking with groups.
It's fascinating, actually. I think there was a period of time where we would get invited into places often because the work that we were doing, or perhaps the opinions that we had, was held by maybe a few of the outsiders in the group. And almost exactly as you put it, someone who is external, rightly or wrongly, and probably most of the time wrongly, the external individual is seen as someone who has greater expertise, greater proficiency, which, to be honest, is not the case, certainly in my situation. I'm often going and speaking with a lot of very, very intelligent people who just tend to have seen the work that we've done and gravitated to similar sort of ideas. It's an interesting dynamic, though, because at any club I think there'll be disagreements between staff, and I think that's healthy, that's more than okay. The issue, I think, is sometimes when they are philosophies that aren't necessarily supported by empirical evidence, or at least some line of evidence-based thought. And they can be really, really tricky situations, because then you start dealing with people and engaging with people who are arguing based on their opinion, almost their faith and their belief, more so than with some degree of empirical data. So they're always delicate situations when you come from externally, because ultimately, in a lot of those situations, it's not your job to come in and tell people what to do. It's to present them with options, and for rationale as to why you might do one thing over the other. But then that's often a conversation that goes on internally without you there. And so sometimes you can be dropped in a place, you parachute in, you be there for maybe half a day or a day, and you'll sometimes watch the evolution of what happens after that to see whether you've had an impact or not. But I think they're fascinating environments to see, and the byplay between different views, different beliefs, and how people argue for and against either their beliefs, their opinion, or the evidence is it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I know in the process of the work that you've done, the research that you've done, you've developed tools that will provide us a mechanism to actually monitor eccentric strength and map and monitor eccentric strength. I'm interested in maybe just getting a little bit closer to that from the point of view. What are the key things that we should be looking for? You know, should we be looking for an absolute peak eccentric strength? Should we be looking for a good profile of strength through range? Should we be looking at ratios between eccentric, concentric strength in hamstrings? What are the key components that you would say?
I mean, there's a thread that we could probably continue on down a long line for a long period of time. I think even just to take it a step back and say the literature at this point in time, I think, is still mixed in terms of any composite measures of strength, or absolute or relative measures of strength, and its ability to identify those at elevated risk of hamstring strain injury. So there's some of our early work that suggests that using a Nordic hamstring exercise test of eccentric strength and just looking at peak force data gave you an ability to identify those at risk in Australian rules football and in Australian soccer, professional soccer back home. Then subsequent work to that from us and then from also others as well has found that maybe that relationship is also not as robust. And you've seen that a little bit with some of the isokinetic strength testing literature over the years as well. It sort of phases in and out of popularity, sometimes just in terms of the most recent paper that's come out. So I think even above and beyond the measurement of strength, what's most important is making sure you get a consistent exposure to eccentric exercise. Now, if you're doing that appropriately and correctly, then clearly you'd like to see increases in eccentric strength over time, and presumably that's part of the mechanism that might protect the athletes or the group of athletes from risk of future hamstring injury. In terms of what different metrics that you can look at, I've always been in favour of the simple things probably tell us meaningful information, and playing around with nuance around the edges, I'm not necessarily sure increases our ability to make that information more meaningful. So from our perspective, it's been things like peak force or an average of 3 repetitions of force, and probably the asymmetry between limbs. All of that then tied in with other factors, age and previous history, at least from a research perspective, but then there's a host of other factors that will probably influence that relationship in practice as well. So generally speaking, I think something quick and something simple tends to give you relatively meaningful information. You could play around with maybe a fatigue index, a hamstring quad ratio. There's a number of things you can look at. Maybe it's rate of force development or other elements you can look at from a dynamometer that might be angle of peak torque and those sort of things. And I don't know that they vary enough to warrant investing a heap of time in looking at heaps of those different things. So you get a general indication of how strong they are. That's not the only thing, but it's probably something that helps understanding where they are and how they might progress in response to the stimulus you're trying to provide them with and the adaptations you're trying to engender. And that it will be one small part of where you move forward from.
So, in the course of the last few years, obviously you've done a fair amount of travelling, speaking with people across the whole of the world in relation to this issue. Have you noticed, if you like, different appetites for taking on board this idea? Because I know eccentrics have been around forever, but certainly in the UK, they haven't been as high profile as they are today for quite some time, and they haven't been as widely adopted as they are certainly being at the moment in professional football, rugby and otherwise. Are there areas of the world which are sort of late adopters, or people that are still just a little bit interested, I suppose?
You could say that not only in different areas of the world, but across different sports in similar regions as well. And you would know with your experience in football and soccer, there's a very, very different culture to what you might see in rugby union and rugby league, for example. We have the same sort of issues back home, well, not issues, but differences between Australian rules football/soccer and the rugby codes. And then you go to the States, and I think the States has got its own sort of culture in a lot of its collegiate sports, through its professional sports and sports that are typically played in the US as well. So there's no doubt there's a different appetite for outside information, but also there's a different appetite for the veracity of evidence, I think, as well. And my view has always been that in my primary role as an academic and as a researcher, my role is to be able to help facilitate research that can help practitioners to make better decisions. And that's not necessarily saying, here's the research paper, follow this exact protocol, implement that into your practice, because it's not how it works. And so my view has always been to try and, as much as I possibly can, lead with evidence and data first, and then talk about how that might fit for the specific environment, for the specific individuals who are working there, and for the individual or specific athletes that they might have concerns about. And you'll see varying degrees of response to that. There are some people who are very keen to follow up on some of the papers you may have spoken about, some of the work you're doing or you are doing, and there's others who almost just want the recipe and the answer and actually don't care about anything that you've spoken about that should underpin that. And to me, that's always a dangerous scenario, because if you're handing out recipes, that might only fit for one unique set of circumstances or situations. And so the need to have a recipe for me never really works, because the advice that you give is predicated on a number of different things that you know from previously and what you then understand about the environment and the athletes that they're working with.
Yeah, but I think that's a really good point. I mean, at the end of the day, an awful lot of the research that you've done, and speaking with previous people on these interviews here, you know, they are prolific researchers, and by its very nature, the research itself, you tend to collect data on a number of people and create norms or means with a certain amount of noise around them. But then we've got to take this information and apply it in sport on an individual level, and try and translate and transition something that's been derived from a norm or an average into an individual prescription, bearing in mind the contextual situation there, which is a huge challenge for applied practitioners, I guess.
And you'll see that there's a big debate around being able to predict injury and predict at the individual level. And from a data perspective, from a research perspective, we're nowhere near that, and nor do I ever think we probably will either. So I think in the ecosystem of it all, research is really good to be able to give you that foundation information to say, here's the A, B and C that we definitely should be doing. Here are other things that have some support in the evidence, and I can see how that's going to fit into our program or your program or whatever it might be. But there's a reason why injuries still occur, because ultimately all the efforts around trying to mitigate risk still probably have to sit some degree secondary to maximising performance. And certainly there's an overlap between the two of them. Low injury rates are going to be typically good for team performance and individual performance. But you could guarantee that if you could have steady injury rates across a club for years, but their performance continued to increase, you take that in a heartbeat. So there's the conversation I often have with a lot of organisations, particularly if they go through a spate of injuries in a short period of time, is it's also dictated by how they're performing at the time. Because if they're performing really well, then clearly some of the strategies they're employing have probably had a really positive impact on a large proportion of the squad. And so there are spot fires going on at the moment, but you don't know how much of what you've implemented are actually benefiting all those other athletes that are then driving performance. Now, when you've got a situation where you're getting a lot of injuries and you're not performing well, then that's probably not a great situation, and there's some of the more interesting conversations.
Absolutely. I go back a few years, and I remember a club I worked at, and I used to have some really enjoyable conversations with one of the S&C coaches we worked with, and something he used to talk about an awful lot was this idea of a minimum effective dose. And you're absolutely right, we should be reading the research and the information that underpins all of this, but at one level that is actually something that I imagine is absolutely central to the work that you've done. The idea that there must be a minimum effective dose to provide an adequate amount of protection to athletes. Is there a prescription that you would... Supposing I was a practitioner in a club, and we had games on a weekly basis, and it was Saturday to Saturday. Within that week, what advice or recommendation would you give in terms of eccentrics?
So, I mean, even before that, I think one of the really important things for us is those conversations that we have with practitioners, yourself or others, about the challenges and the barriers they have in terms of implementation. Because what I said earlier is one of the things we like to try and do is facilitate research that can help answer questions and or in some case, be able to work around some of those barriers. So it was probably 3 or 4 years ago now we had a conversation with a few guys from Premier League clubs, maybe not necessarily operating on a week-to-week schedule, maybe there was a little bit more fixture congestion in there. But it was the same question. There's RCT protocols out there that are well known, the Peterson study and Van der Horst studies, and they have set protocols that have shown to have an effect. And the question is that what we need to do exactly? Is it that prescription of that training protocol that we need to do? And looking at some of those prescriptions where you might be having to expose people 2 to 3 times per week, with upwards of 15 to 20 repetitions per session. And the reality is that in the applied environment, that's almost never going to happen, or very, very rarely. So we had a guy back home, a guy called Joel Presland, who did a study looking at whether exposure to high or low volume Nordics, or a high or low dosage of Nordics across a 4-week period, had differential effects on their adaptation. And so clearly with that sort of study, we're not following up for injury rates. We're looking at sort of indirect measures to say, is this effective in being able to try and address risk factors? And for us, it was looking at eccentric strength and fascicle length, a structural characteristic that we think is important. And what we found was that after a standardised 2-week training block, where they had 2 sessions per week, and they did some moderate volumes, probably a total of about 40 reps in those first 2 weeks, the low volume group dropped down to 1 exposure a week, 2 by 4. So they did 8 reps in a week. The other group continued to increase until they got out to a maximum of 100 repetitions a week across 2 sessions. Right. So that's insanely high volume, and you'll never see anyone who's going to do that anyway. But what we found was that the adaptation was almost identical between those 2 groups. So with the Nordic, you were able to get away with 8 reps compared to 100 reps, and the adaptation was the same. Now, you might make the argument that the optimal level of volume to drive adaptation sits somewhere between those 2 extremes, and I think that's certainly feasible. But the main takeaway from us was that you can actually get away with low volume so long as you've got a near maximal or super maximal intensity. So one of the key elements of that study was that with the prescription of the Nordic, people tend to do them as bodyweight exercise. When they can control it all the way through a range, they'll just keep doing more of them. And I think the real benefit of the exercise, because it certainly has a number of limitations, but the real benefit of it is it's eccentric only and it's a super maximal intensity. If you get to a point where it's no longer challenging you at that level, then we started to get people to hold a weight plate so that they would eventually get to failing some point in that range of motion. So it was more an argument that if you can maintain high intensity, then you can get away with low volumes. And we've certainly seen that those rep ranges, 8, 9, 10 reps a week, has certainly been adopted in a number of places following that work.
And I suppose the thing that immediately springs to mind for me, and would have done with the S&C coach I was speaking to, was so the study was done on 8 reps versus up to 100 reps. Is it possible it could have actually been equally successful with 4 reps? Or 1 rep?
Yeah, I think, so we've got a little bit more work ongoing in that space where we'll look at an intermittent low volume protocol where they'll do 8 reps one week, nothing the next, 8 reps the week after. Same sort of argument that you've got there, but slightly different. It's certainly possible and it's certainly feasible. Yeah. I think the maintenance of intensity is the most important thing, and that probably carries across a lot of other qualities. But the maintenance of intensity is most important, and that data would suggest that volume is secondary or tertiary to that.
I think on a more general level, I hear what you were saying earlier, and I absolutely am with you 100%. I mean, people have talked for years about prevention of injuries, which is a bit of a nonsense conversation in my mind, and the whole idea of risk mitigation is a much more sensible approach to take. And I think these conversations are actually being had in different corridors in football clubs now. So traditionally it would have been between S&C and maybe the medical people, but now you've got people coming in who might be chief execs or people from the board who appreciate that they have got huge assets in these athletes that form these teams, and any time out of action is a cost to the organisation. So they begin to understand this. Are you having conversations at that level at all then with the people that sign the checks?
Pay the bills, but it's probably 5 or 6 years ago now. had a guy who eventually came on to do his PhD, Jack Hickey, who did a very, very simple analysis of the cost of hamstring injuries in the AFL. And the salaries in Australian rules football are certainly moderate compared to what you see in the pointy end of professional soccer over in Europe. But it basically boiled down to the fact that each club in the Australian Football League was paying for an extra player per year because they lost a player every week, basically, as a result of hamstring injuries. Now, that's probably magnified to some extent back home because it's a sport that also has a salary cap. So you have a finite amount of salary that you can spend on your squad. And so if you're paying money to players who can't play, then there's an impact implication there. The genesis of that study was to actually try and shape the discussion around cost and value of injuries, with the view that, okay, we needed to be having conversations with people at the coalface, but if you're ever going to have impact, whether it was money to fund research or whatever it might be, or for clubs to put more resources into their conditioning staff and their medical staff, then surely that would be an argument that resonates.
Yeah.
It didn't happen as much or anywhere near as quickly as I thought. It's interesting to hear you say that perhaps more of that is happening these days. Sporting clubs to me operate like no other sort of traditional business on the planet. If you're losing money hand over fist year after year to a workplace related incident or injury, then clearly most organisations will look at what are the strategies they can do to reduce that, and it becomes a priority. And I don't necessarily think that is always the case. The cost of injury is not necessarily quantified financially, and there's obviously other elements. If you've got good players who get injured, that's far worse than players who are lower on down the list. But I've always been amazed that the bean counters haven't cared so much about it when it hums along at that sort of moderate to moderate high level. Often they get really concerned when there's a lot of injuries, but then they have no concern or no interest. Then all of a sudden, their interest and concern is through the roof.
Yeah.
From a selfish perspective and from a research perspective, if it meant that people understood the cost of being able to deal with those injuries better, and then organisations were willing to pay for research to be done, that'd be a great outcome. But at the club level, if you're able to provide more opportunities for people to work in those environments because it's seen as a growing issue and a big issue, to me that would be a fantastic outcome.
One closing question, and it's more gazing forward rather than reflecting on the work that's taken place. So we know a huge amount more about hamstring function, hamstring injury, and hamstring injury risk because of the work of you and your colleagues. What does the future hold? Where are we going to be going in the future in terms of this body of work?
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of a dichotomy at the moment between maybe the direction of where the research might head and what probably is needed from a practical perspective. I mean, we're certainly doing a little bit of work at the moment with a PhD student back home, Joshua Ruddy, looking at complex systems approaches to modelling data. So whether that's elements of machine learning and understanding how a number of different variables might interact with each other to determine then an individual's risk, as opposed to using univariate or single variables or a couple of different variables. And I go back and forth on this a little bit. It's a fascinating field, but I actually don't know whether its impact will be that great at the applied or practical level. Now, you might look at people who start to employ data scientists or people with computer science backgrounds and those sort of things to be able to develop some of those models in-house, as we'll be able to take things from research in time, use those models, input their own data and be able to use that moving forward. So there's a preoccupation in academic circles, I think, with that, and there may be practically as well. But I think there's still a need to be able to look at simple, objective, practically friendly variables that might help to inform strategies, risk mitigation strategies better. The more recent example I can think of is some of the work that JB Morin and his group have done looking at force velocity profiling of sprint running. And I think those sort of measures that previously would have been done in a biomechanics lab, all of a sudden now you have access to be able to do it in the field with some very, very low-end tech and at the very, very low end with an app. To me, from a practical perspective, looking to how we can take really useful, meaningful lab-based measures and apply them practically is still something that's really important to us. So while we continue to do some of the academic work around risk mitigation, identifying risk, I think there's also still scope to say, is there any room for better tools that can be used by practitioners simply, can provide them with information quickly that can help them to influence their decision-making process.
And I guess that's the challenge for you, kind of just closing there, that you've got to keep reminding yourself that this work has to have practical application, and you don't end up going down academic rabbit holes, really.
No, rabbit holes is a good term, I think, for it. And there's always a process of, there's certain things that you know you need to initiate in the lab, because that's the only way you can start to prove some of those concepts, to then working your way almost, the conduit then to what its application might be in practice. And that's a fine balance. But that's the point I came back to, or brought up earlier, is I think our role is to try and help practitioners, provide them with data so they can make better decisions or more informed decisions. And that's not going to mean that you eradicate injuries. It just means that people may in time be able to plan better, put in place better interventions. And if injuries do happen, maybe they'll have a better understanding of why they happened and what they need to do next time to mitigate their risk. But to me anyway, it's no fun to do research just for the sake of research. If it has an impact for people, that's great, and that's the ultimate goal for us.
Fascinating stuff. Really insightful. I do appreciate you taking the time out, David. Thanks very much, and good luck with the presentation.